The topic of my presentation today is about adaptive water governance, guiding concepts, feasibility and research implications. Adaptive governance. Where does this concept come from? The discussion started with the ideas of adaptive management, and the roots of adaptive management are in ecology in the 1970s. Buzz Holling from the University of Florida and colleagues were looking at, for instance, the Everglades system, which was not functioning well, was somehow stuck, and the measures that people were taking to improve the situation in the Everglades were not working. What Professor Holling and colleagues found out is that ecosystems are complex, they are nested, and they have emergent properties. So you cannot explain the functioning of the whole system from the individual parts. And also these ecosystems have several alternative equilibrium states. That means that water in a lake, for instance, can go from fully transparent to green, filled with algae in very short time, and it might be very hard to get it back. All these properties, the complexity, the nested character, the emergence, make ecosystem behavior very uncertain and unpredictable at very profound levels. And adaptive management is or was meant to address this. The key concepts here are experimentation, monitoring, and learning. Now, what you see in this literature is that the relatively technocratic nature of adaptive management, very science-based, natural science-based even, was criticized a lot for leaving stakeholders and participants out. So what happened is that this literature, because of the criticism, started merging with the notion of co-management. Co-management is about involving stakeholders and participants in the actual management. And if you combine adaptive management with co-management, you get a new literature on adaptive co-management, which I call ACM in this lecture. And Derek Armitage from Canada, University of Waterloo, was one of the first with colleagues to coin this term in 2007. So that's a reference that you can refer to if you're interested in learning more. Now, adaptive co-management, or ACM, implies certain ideas about how to govern. And so if your governance system is set up according to the ideas of ACM, you can label this adaptive governance. The questions that I will address in this presentation are the following. What are the guiding concepts in the literature on adaptive co-management actually? Do these ideas make sense from the perspective of the literature on governance in general? Can adaptive co-management be used as a guidance to set up a water governance regime in real life? And is this feasible? And finally, how to use the ideas from adaptive co-management thinking as an inspiration for research. So I'm imagining that quite a few of you are PhD students or junior scholars still thinking about orienting your project in a certain direction. How could adaptive co-management or adaptive governance inspire you? Starting with the first question on guiding concepts. Some of these concepts are to do with institutions, the institutional setup of the water regime, water governance regime. And there are 4 ideas about institutions in the adaptive co-management literature. The first one is that the approach should be polycentric rather than monocentric. And not only polycentric, but also a polycentric approach that works as a system. So there should be collaboration. What does that mean? It means that the governance is taken on from multiple centers and they coordinate with each other. And these centers can be in many places. It can be about companies. It can be about communities. It can be about individuals. It can also be about cities and regions. But the thing is that polycentric governments places responsibility on all of these units to work on a particular issue and also to collaborate so that greater problem-solving capacity is achieved in the end. Adaptive co-management also requires that there are high levels of public participation. So involving the stakeholders in the public and the public in the water governance system, and not only for getting approval of ideas that you thought about beforehand, but actually defining the problems together and also sharing power with each other. Experimentation is the third institutional idea of adaptive co-management. It's about taking measures in the ecosystem, or maybe also in the governance system, on the basis of theory and see how the system responds. So this notion of having a theory about what is the cause of the problem and then taking measures and seeing how the system reacts, that's experimentation. And then a fourth institutional guiding idea is that the approach should be bioregional. So we should look at ecosystems in their entirety, not in individual components, and take measures at the level of the ecosystem as a whole. And of course, in water governance, the bioregional approach is translated into a river basin management approach. But there are some guiding concepts in the adaptive co-management literature, which are not so much about institutions, they are rather about what we're after in this approach. And a key topic is learning. Learning can be about many things. It's about the acquisition of new knowledge, that you learn new facts. But it can also be about a change in perspectives, that your priorities change because of what you're doing in the water management. And it can be about changes in the level of understanding between actors. So in any water governance system, there are networks operating, and there's a level of trust between these actors that can be affected by the way, of course, the river basin is managed. And then also very important is that it's not only about learning. It should not be a theoretical exercise. The ideas and the findings of adaptive co-management should also be actually implemented. And for that, you need agency. And agency is the capacity to act on the lessons learned, to the capacity to connect between initiatives in a polycentric system. So if many companies, many regions, many cities are taking initiatives, these need to be connected. You need agency for that. And it's also the capacity to change governance regimes. So sometimes the lessons are so fundamental that actually transformative change is needed in the governance regime. Then my second question, does this idea make sense from a governance perspective? So if the ideas about adaptive co-management stem largely from, let's say, how do I say it, the scientific community that is engaged in natural resources management, there's also a community of scholars that is studying governance. They also have ideas about these guiding concepts. Let's look at all 6 of them. The first one was polycentric approach and collaboration. I think that this is firmly established in the governance literature. It provides evidence that in complex situations, it is indeed better to have self-organizing small units making decisions. This could be referred to as the Ostrom school, after Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom, who have written a lot about this approach to governance. And what you see actually, for instance, in the climate change discussion globally, is that smaller units like communities, cities, companies, provinces are indeed seen as essential in the face of inaction at the national or international level. So a polycentric approach provides for backups if nothing is happening at the national or international level. So that idea is resonates with the governance literature. Public participation. Who could be against public participation? It's almost universally applauded and supported. Also, evidence for efficacy exists, so that public participation has certain effects. And you might refer to the work of Professor Jens Newig, who was one of the lecturers in this course. But it's not all roses here. Different models of democracy exist. And if public participation is an expression of direct democracy thinking, that line of thinking is not always in line with representative democracy. And so elected politicians are not always that happy if citizens and stakeholders start interfering, as they might see it, in water governance decisions. Also, there are worries about the citizens that actually participate, or the stakeholders that actually come to the table if you invite them. What are their motivations actually? Are they publicly interested or privately interested? Or are they after societal conflict? Or are they rather avoiding conflict, which is sometimes also not productive, of course? What is their representative? Is public participation maybe for the rich and for the powerful and the affluent? And is everybody else perhaps hindered to join the public participation exercises? And there are, of course, concerns about the quality of input. So do people really understand the system at a fundamental level? And is the knowledge that they provide, is that useful for the decision process? On to the next key concepts in adaptive co-management literature. Experimentation. I think it's fair to say that in the governance literature, the idea of experimentation has had its highs and its lows. So especially after World War II, it was seen as the ideal way of formulating policy. Sociologist Donald Campbell wrote about the experimenting society. To a degree, this was influenced by two conditions. One is the expanse of the state in this period. So the welfare state started coming up, but also the experience with military planning in the war made people more reliant on technocratic and planned approaches to governing. And experimentation was seen as part and parcel of this. But there are some worries as well in the governance literature about this idea that we should experiment when we govern water. What is the institutional patience? So an experiment with an intervention in a water system could take 5 or 10 years to unfold. That means that the experiment will outlast the period of any elected politician, which might be active for 4 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 6 tops. And so can a politician really wait that long for the experiment to come to fruition? Also, is there the willingness to learn on behalf of the political system? What you see quite often with experiments is that the findings are used in a way that fits with political interest. So everybody can invoke the results of the experiment, but they will always interpret the results in the way that fits with their interests. Also, experimentation can be manipulated. So let's say that the idea of experimentation can sound as a sort of a neutral and positive idea, but if the idea behind the experiment is actually to delay further decision making, you could say that maybe the experiment is being misused. And then, of course, what is the right scale of experimentation? We don't know. But what you're seeing, for instance, in the global climate change discussion is that some very rich people go to the ocean, dump certain chemicals in there, in the idea that CO2 will be binded better by the ocean. Now that's an experiment, but it's not the kind of experiment that we want. And also in the climate debate, there are, of course, suggestions sometimes for engineered solutions that will be a quick fix for the whole climate change problem globally. But, you know, we have only one world to experiment with. So is that then the right scale to experiment, you might ask? The bioregional approach is very interesting. There is a specific literature that you are getting to know in this course on water governance. And in that literature, there is no contestation at all about the notion of river basin management and river basin organizations. But the wider governance literature actually looks upon this in a more suspicious way. There are worries about the interplay between river basin organizations and other institutions. Also, it has been noted that even though it's intuitively appealing that you define the boundaries of a river basin by its natural boundaries, but it's quite unclear actually what these are sometimes. Do you take into account groundwater when you look at a river system, for instance? Do you take into account the land around this? And before you know it, this can be actually quite, something that is not so natural, but requires very active decision making. Then, what are the guarantees for good governance at this scale? It has been noted that river basin organizations have been proposed by environmental NGOs, for instance, as a way to bypass local national governments. And there are quite often quite technocratic ideas associated with this idea of a river basin organization. But what is the democratic legitimation here actually? Is that always okay? Can a river basin organization maybe also be quite a distant organization to everybody? Then the final two guiding concepts, learning. Governance scholars will say learning is kind of a holy grail. It's considered extremely important for solving wicked problems. Wicked problems are a special class of problems where we don't agree about the norms and values that we should apply to a situation. And we're also not sure about the facts, so what is actually happening in reality. The wicked problems or unstructured in that there's no agreement on knowledge and there's no agreement on values that should be applied. What the governance literature supports here is that learning your way out, so to speak, is the way forward. But when you look at this literature, and our colleague, Professor Andrea Gerlach, will delve into this much deeper than I can do here, is that there's a lot of conceptual confusion what constitutes learning actually. There's a lack of precision in this literature and not a very clear cumulative agenda or building of evidence here. So we kind of don't know at the moment what helps learning and what does not helping and why. Then the final point, agency. Many theories of policy change in the governance literature emphasize how rare it is that policy or governance systems change. And when they change, the suggestion from the governance literature is that it's usually to do with disasters, incidents, maybe with some political turbulence, so a new leader that arrives, or just blunt coincidence. And that means that the idea that is embedded in adaptive co-management of structured change based on learning is kind of questioned in the governance literature. And so, but what we do need here is more insight into how to nudge, steer, and influence change. It is clear that leadership will be critical here. And the governance literature speaks at least about two types of leadership. One is about bridging, and one is about bonding. Bridging leadership is about connecting communities that are dealing with an issue, maybe even connecting countries or continents. So it's about connecting separate units. Bonding leadership is about keeping your community together and making sure that it's coherent and that everybody's on board within the community. These two forms of leadership are discussed quite a lot in the governance literature, and you also see them in that discussion on adaptive governance. Now, feasibility. All I want to say is that if you try to introduce an adaptive co-management approach to, let's say, a particular river basin or a lake that you want to improve, you can expect a lot of opposition. So collaboration will always be difficult. And so if the approach really relies on collaboration between many stakeholders, you will run, especially in certain political systems, into a lot of distrust and competition. There are many political systems where that is actually the norm. And so the idea of saying, let's collaborate together and solve the problem, it might not fly in particular jurisdictions. Then experimentation, it sounds very nice, but you will meet a lot of experiments. And so think about you in the position of a policymaker. You would like to experiment, but if you're a citizen living somewhere and you depend for your flood safety on what the government is doing, would you like to be experimented upon? So imagine yourself as a subject of experimentation. Many people will not like this actually. Experiments are also costly, not only in terms of resources, not only in terms of time, so you have to wait 5 or 10 years, but also in terms of opportunity costs. If you experiment on the basis of one particular idea, one particular approach, it might actually be that you're losing time, because if it doesn't work out and you find out that the approach doesn't work, you've lost 5 or 10 years and you have lost the opportunity to try another approach, which might be better. So there are opportunity costs. And of course, it's unclear at what scale to try out adaptive management. Like I said, it's hard to imagine us applying adaptive co-management to the globe as a whole. But it has been tried. So I see adaptive co-management, adaptive governance as a paradigm to water governance of sorts. And so it's interesting to see that in certain cases, these ideas, this paradigm has actually been implemented. And my favorite book about this was written by Kai Lee in 1993. It's called Compass and Gyroscope. And it presents insights from multiple US cases, including the Everglades, but also the Columbia River Basin, where adaptive co-management has indeed been tried. And what does Kai Lee say about when is it possible to try this? What he says is a number of conditions. Decision makers are aware that they're experimenting anyway. So the notion of experimentation is not so alien to them, because even the approach that they normally do is an experiment. If they admit that, then everything becomes an experiment, and experimentation becomes less scary. But he also seems to apply that the situation really has to get quite bad. So the preservation of pristine environments is no longer an option. The return to a fully natural situation is not possible. And in that condition, environmental NGOs are probably more likely to collaborate also with an idea where you're experimenting with new approaches. This is not something you do in an undisturbed natural area or an undisturbed river basin. Of course, you need resources to measure the ecosystems. You need theory, models, and field methods to have them available to sort of raise certain questions and suggest certain approaches. And there must be an organizational culture that encourages learning. That's not always the case, because learning is best from failure. And many organizations try not to be seen as failing. And so if an experiment fails, the organization should actually be happy, even if that is quite hard also for the leadership of an organization. And like we suggested, institutional patience must exist. So you must have policymakers that don't start messing, so to speak, with the approach within a year or within 2 years. That's kind of hard for an elected politician that has, is in office for 4 or 5 years and sees maybe receives indications that the experiment is not going well. And there are many more. So Kylie laid them out quite well. And that means that adaptive co-management is maybe not suitable every time, but perhaps some basins, also ones that we study in New Wave, qualify for the approach. Now, my last 2 slides are about a research agenda. So how could you use this idea about adaptive co-management to frame your own research? Suppose that you're just starting. What are the interesting issues that arise here? As I said, the first one is at the paradigmatic level. I see adaptive co-management, adaptive governance, as a paradigm of governance, but there are many more. There are many other paradigms in play. And the most dominant of all, of course, in water governance is integrated water resources management. What is the difference actually between adaptive co-management and integrated water resources management? Are they so far apart, or are they kind of the same? What you also see is that adaptive co-management is about change and about agency. It's not the only paradigm that thinks about that. Another one that's quite prominent is transitions management. How does it compare adaptive co-management as a theory of action to transitions management? Different or the same? And I think it would be interesting to drill further into the assumptions that underpin adaptive co-management thinking, and especially would be interested in knowing more about the knowledge claims that in adaptive co-management are prioritized, and what is the relation between science and policy that is assumed here. Adaptive co-management has quite a reputation of being quite a scientifically inspired approach to water governance. Then to another level, this idea of adaptive governance, of adaptive co-management is circulating around the world and is introduced in certain jurisdictions, maybe also in places where it wasn't invented or where it wasn't tried out before, as with other paradigms, of course. But how does this happen? Like, how is this idea of adaptive co-management diffusing around the world? Who are the actors that are propagating it? What are the constituencies behind it? And of course, who benefits and who loses from it? And so that's a very political question about adaptive co-management. Then I think it's also interesting to sort of disaggregate this notion of adaptive co-management. And then you'll find much to like as a governance scholar. How are experiments and public participation involved in learning? What kind of learnings do they create? What kind of learning do they not create? Is learning or experimentation a condition for agency to develop and unfold? So one of the studies that I've done myself about large-scale policy changes in water governance systems around the world shows that experiments are quite often a condition for preparing a system for change. And so experiments seem to play a role in larger scale change. but is that a necessary condition, or is it just a coincidence that we have spotted this in quite a few occasions? There's also an agenda to do with bioregional organizations, concretely river basin organizations. How do they get introduced? How well do they function? Are they really the solution for sustainability challenges? And is a polycentric governance regime with its emphasis on decentralized and multiple units, is that better at innovating and adapting to climate change than the opposite, which is maybe a monocentric one? So the last slide that I have is to do with these agenda points. So I just want to refer you to some of the work that we've done here in Amsterdam on these various topics. The first one is to do with experiments and learning. A very nice thesis, PhD thesis by Belinda McFadden about water policy experiments and how they affected learning in a particular network that was involved in the experiment, but also the policymakers around it. And the second book is about water policy entrepreneurs. This is a book about agency. And the starting point of it is that some people are making bigger changes in water governance systems than others. And what we ask here is, who were these people and what were their strategies? Why were they so effective in bringing water governance systems in a new direction? And in a way, it's also an overview of some of the direction of the changes that are going on in water governance systems locally. Then the third one that I want to mention is about river basin organizations. This is one of the innovations that is propagated by water governance scholars, but does it really work well in reality? There's a lot of politics around it. And then finally, we've studied this notion of polycentric governance and its effect on innovation and adaptiveness. Is this system really better than a monocentric governance system in changing innovation and in changing water governance systems? So I conclude. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope I have presented you at least a flavor of the notion of adaptive governance and adaptive co-management, that I have indicated you what it is about, under what conditions maybe water governance systems could turn to this idea, this paradigm, and also which interesting research venues it portrays. Thank you very much for your attention.